Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of the year. And to kick off the year, we thought it would be really good to have an important voice to set the tone and set the pace of the work that we want to do this year. And I'm really pleased to have Thiresh Govender with us here this evening to present a talk on his work. As many of you may know, Thiresh has been an integral part of the development of the GSA as leader of Unit 14, a mantle that he has handed over to Yan Gong here. Thiresh is going to be pursuing more work in his own practice and also work further afield and developing some really very interesting themes. And I think what's really fascinating for me about the work is the way that the research work that Thiresh has been involved with through the unit and also independently works alongside the work of the practice, and they're kind of indistinguishable. And I think that's a really very interesting model for us to observe and to understand and to appreciate how that practice works. I think I know it's going to be an enjoyable lecture this evening. I actually met Thiresh in a sense before we physically met. I was teaching in Trinidad. I was teaching an urban design course as part of the urban planning program at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, and I came across a really fascinating video produced by the African Centre for Cities that was the story of a participatory planning process in a township, I believe in Cape Town. I can't remember the name of it. And as part of the process, the team of planners and sociologists and architects went into a community and, rather in a way imposing a design upon them, engaged the members of the community in dialogue, in conversation. And as part of that process, and as those stories and narratives were being drawn out of the community, there was somebody illustrating those stories and illustrating in a way the lessons or the messages that were coming out of those stories. And that person was Thiresh before I knew him. So I was really surprised when I then visited the GSA to find him such an integral part. But it made a lot of sense because I think in a way the work that he does is an interpretation of human need, of human desire, the translation of that into architectural or urban design representation, and then to its realization. So I'm really looking forward to what he's going to share with us this evening to hear some more of that. And I would also like to invite you, as he gives his talk, please, if you have any questions or if you have a reflection or a thought, or if there's anything that he says that triggers a thought or an idea that you'd like to share afterwards, please post it in the chat. We'll collect them and we can share those thoughts and reflections with Thiresh afterwards and hopefully have a conversation, a reflection on what he's presenting to us this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Thiresh Govender, his presentation to us this evening. Thank you very much, Thiresh.
Hey, Mark. Hey, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to this. And I must say it's quite nice to be on the other side of the GSA tables and have some of what I do put up for scrutiny and reflection. So I'm looking forward to that. Again, Mark, thanks for the opportunity. Let's see if we could jump in. I hope you can see my screen round about now. And I know it's I'm cutting into dinner time and sometimes family time, so I understand that the tension may be a little bit all over. But if you could give me about 45 to 50 minutes to basically sketch out a frame of interest, and this frame of interest has been a labor of love over a period of time, and I'd just like to take you on a little bit of a story about what this is. So I'll get into a little bit about what insurgent architectures mean, but I'd like to maybe take us back a little bit about where this all started for me. And funny enough, it started with a goat and a spinach. While I was doing my studies in London, I was introduced to someone called John Fraser, who looked at this idea of evolutionary architecture, and he presented this opening slide to us in the course, and he says that what's the primary difference between these two subjects here? And we couldn't get it until he explained it to us that the spinach will be a spinach and will stay a spinach for the rest of its life, and there's not much mutation that plays out whereas the goat as a species over time, it really evolves and adapts and starts adjusting to be quite synchronous with its environment. And I was quite intrigued by this idea about an architecture that was kind of responsive to its environments, but however, in London, and the kind of really Western way of looking at this felt very foreign to me. I didn't understand how this architecture could be intelligent, and it was presented to me with a whole lot of computational power that was quite foreign to me, and I had no idea how to apply it, so I dismissed that. But there was something quite nagging about this idea of an architecture that had a built-in intelligence to its environment. And subsequent to my studies in the UK about 15 odd years ago, I went on a search for this goats and architectures of goats. And I spent some time in the Latin Americas, backpacking as one does when you start searching for yourself. And I came across a series of works or projects that were made in a kind of iterative manner, but had something in it that worked profoundly well. And I was intrigued by it, and I started to develop and expand my thinking about how this goat or intelligence can feature without high-tech computational power, but something that is quite everyday. And following that, I found myself in tracking Ernest Hemingway's bodegas in Havana, and I was trying to plot like what on earth do I do next with my life post my studies, and through a series of sketchbooks and conversations with myself with some Cuban rum, I decided it was time to start a practice to put some substance to this inquiry, because I didn't want to do it as an artist, but I thought to lean on my professional capacity to advance this. So came back to Johannesburg and started a studio, and I thought that I needed a legitimate way to become quite playful and experimental. And the studio had all the kinds of structural, legal structures behind it. It was an incredibly playful space for experimentation and learning, with beautiful conversations. But there was something that was underlying in me that felt that there was something uncertain about practicing as it stood right now for me, because there's something that I felt needed to be unearthed or presented, and I couldn't make sense of the mess and the turmoil around me. And I insisted that the practice measure how quickly it acts and builds, and I thought we needed to listen a lot more. So it was quite deliberate, but I just didn't realize how long listening would play out. And I found that in South Africa, particularly in Johannesburg, I've come across a series of these other architectures that were quite had another kind of built-in intelligence again into it, that was made by the occupants themselves, and they presented some extraordinary functionality, and they were often functioning on the margins of legality, and they were also quite removed from what was the historical centers of our cities. And I was intrigued by the shebeens, because the shebeens in Cape Town that I visited was my first introduction to this kinds of typology of a man-made architecture. I was lucky enough to study these quite intimately, trying to understand the patterns of life that plays out and the kind of reciprocal architecture that gets formed by this. So these are the kinds of ethnographic drawings that were produced to understand the operative aspects to how these architectures were made, and it just allowed me like a really interesting indulgence to spend some time to reflect on how they work and what they're about. It was also quite clear that this is the reality for the majority of our world, and I also wanted to understand where do I sit in who I seek to serve as a practitioner. And through the understanding of these shebeens, we understand that it's not just the architecture, but it's the objects within these things that all cumulatively arrange themselves to give it different kinds of values. So this relationship between object and architecture, and later the city, all became one kind of integrated set of devices that makes up our spaces. And what was peculiar for me was that even though there's a seemingly chaoticness to the way these structures were assembled and were used, that there were some underlying patterns. And my kind of researcher in me wanted to understand, what are the patterns? What are the things that's making certain things in this really volatile, uncertain world quite predictable? Like you're seeing certain things repeat over and over and over again. And I want to understand what is the syntax of these things, and how could we understand it with the intention to manage a set of outcomes from it, because there were some really predictable outcomes from these. And what struck me about this at the time was that the Shebeens were seen as quite a toxic site program and a typology by the state at the time. And I could understand why it presented itself like that and why it was seen like that. But my time in Europe also helped me register time in the context of some deviant typologies. So while it may be deviant for now, what we find, if certain typologies are given the space to mature, they become really important icons of a particular place. And I'm interested to know, how can we discern what is quite uncomfortable right now, and how do we usher it to become something that is quite rooted in this place, to become something of a really beautiful, productive, and poetic future. So this is like the old beer halls in Munich, and if you go into Munich, they're quite celebrated tourist sites and important cultural sites. And what struck me thereafter was quite a sober reality, that our context, at least the context that I concerned myself with, was revealing increased levels of social unrest, poor governance, limited resources, spatial fragmentation. This scar of apartheid played out incredibly strongly, and we had an infrastructure that was breaking at the seams, and that was problematic for me. We had limited economic growth, extreme levels of violence, and extreme structural inequality, and it felt like an overwhelming barrage or an attack on myself, being a built environment professional trying to seek better. And how does one navigate in this space of like great unrest and volatility, which I call the crisis? And it came to a head for me when a few years ago, when we worked on the High Court precinct, which is quite an important civic piece of architecture in downtown Johannesburg. And I thought that if we're working with the judges and the justices of the High Court of Johannesburg, surely we can manage some of the pressures around our cities and get this right. And I was saddened to see how even in sites of great institutional power, we cannot wrestle what I would imagine a healthy public civic commons in our spaces. So it said to me that if we can't get it right in these kinds of spaces where you've got really influential and powerful people, I'm not sure where else we could get this thing right, apart from making more siloed environments. And I am interested in a kind of integrated built environment. So in the High Court precinct, we documented all sorts of troubles. I'm not talking just spatial troubles. I'm talking about issues with how prisoners would enter the High Court past the ShopRite truck that was trying to manage its own delivery. The court couldn't claim a dignified, safe space to operate and conduct its duties. You had justices walking past Nyope addicts, and you had high levels of institutional corruption that was playing out. So the lack of civic trust made a really tough environment socially and institutionally to think about what you intervene in it. And this is just an example of a site of how we describe crises. And I think it's really important to understand not just the infrastructural, but the social relations that bring great strain to the sites that we operate as architects. And then there was two ideas that became necessary for me to look at in the context of this deep crisis. Is this idea of being insurgent, that I think that while I really admire our democratic dispensation, I think that there are some things that we are not aggressive about in the way we advance the interests of the majority of our people. And I felt that there was an attitude that needed to be developed. And it was an attitude around insurgents. And I thought that I would like to be insurgent. And I would also I had a certain appreciation for those who were being insurgent, wanting better than what the government could provide. So it's not about being disobedient, but basically saying what you are providing is not good enough and we want more, and it necessitated an insurgent practice. And the second idea was one that I enjoyed by Nicholas Taleb of anti-fragile, which is this property of systems in which where things, the more they put under stress and shocks and trauma, the stronger they get because of those things. So between this ideas of being insurgent and anti-fragile, I thought that those were interesting attributes to approach an architectural conversation with. And I think that helped me try to look at what do I want to inform the practice with. So you'll hear from me, I'm not looking to build quite quickly. I'm looking to first understand, and I've taken a really long time to try to make sense of what is a becoming set of, quite an evolving set of chaotic situations we're finding throughout our cities. And there are two main avenues that this was conducted in over the last few years. One was to look at this idea of what I call frontier urbanisms. These are cities or sites that are in a state of rampant becoming. We don't know what it's about. We're trying to understand as it is becoming. And the township for me became one of those frontier urbanism sites. And I was fortunate enough to work with two colleagues in Cape Town, social scientists, to look at the various aspects that constitute the township economy and how is it made, both, looking at the intersection between space, economy, and policy. So those are the kinds of things that we were interested in. These took us across, I think, about 10 or 11 sites throughout the country, including in Namibia, which allowed us to get a really interesting representation of some of these sites, what I would call frontier urban sites, where things were becoming, and how do we sense make of it. So that was a really phenomenal experience to understand the state of our townships throughout the country. And through these exercises, what was clear for me was that the exchanges we make, it started off with economic exchanges, so there was a commercial basis to it. But this idea of exchange, complex sets of exchanges, be it cultural exchanges, financial exchanges, illicit exchanges, these transactions that we made, both legal and illegal, constituted some really, they were the things that was making our city. And following that, there was an invitation by the GSA about 6 or 7 years ago, which said, would you be interested to come and advance something at the unit in the GSA? And I grabbed it with two hands, not knowing how much of hard work it is, but it was a wonderful experience to be part of the school for about 6 years, to advance some of these hunches I've had in practice, and to give it some kind of theoretical framing, and to deepen the methods as to how does one go about looking, revealing, documenting these sites. The idea for me of trying to document is to sense make, and hopefully to redeploy as an architect in the conceptualization of these of our work. So a lot of effort was spent on the methods, on how do we see, how do we manage our own subjectivity between things that are good or bad, and how do we start talking about issues of what I imagine like really everyday objects. And the everyday objects and practices, they became amplified to have incredible political bearing. And I was interested to know how the laws and the social contracts are produced through these everyday acts around everyday objects. And things of ethnography and behaviorology and the human body and how it goes about making these spaces and means of representation became obsessions within the unit. And through these things, we are trying to understand how call it the mechanics and the syntax of social relations start becoming quite systemized. And on these systems, we can establish an architectural program or an architectural kind of envelope around these pieces. So these are the things that the unit tried to observe. It also tried to look at looking at time. So we don't only look backwards, but we look forward. So in the way we try to use conventional drawings, we try to talk about an architectural condition having a series of moments, not a Instagrammable or photographic moment. And how do we make a policy from this? Because we think that this law is being made live through an architecture and a lived architecture. So we're interested to know, how do we rescript a new kind of social contract? And these are the drawings by one of the students, Yusuf Patel, who looked at this thing of assault economies. It was a really provocative piece of work, which basically talked about how these transactions, they're not, it's not something you buy into. This is an example of a window washer in a street in Johannesburg that will come up to you and give you a service, and you're kind of obliged to pay him, and most likely you do. But we really like these things about these assaults, where you are forced into transactions in Johannesburg, and it re-emphasized, for me at least, the basis of how an architecture in our cities are being produced through a series of exchanges, warranted or unwarranted. And so following from the investigations within townships and the real gift of having the academy as a place to explore and experiment and to deepen the research, the practice also spent significant amount of time looking at other projects within South Africa. And through these sites, there are a series of insights that play out. One of the things is about understanding what the base infrastructure is, because we inherit existing infrastructures upon which we accumulate additional add-ons. We seldom have clean sites to work in, and I think that in my career, I'm more interested in working with inherited infrastructures and seeing how we can start shifting them, because the inherited infrastructures are the ones that's requiring the greatest transformation. So we were interested in about accumulation. These are examples about how a shebeen in Evelyn Street in Windhoek is able to be incredibly catalytic in bringing about change. So we always talking within our urban planning discourse and urban design discourse, how do we stimulate the economy? And we found that it's the weirdest thing that one of the most toxic and noxious kinds of programs is bringing an incredible level of activity and economic life within our cities. So so we got quite excited about this. And what we find interesting within these sites is that there's a level of investment, really careful investment by the actors and operators of these sites to invest within their sites, and they all invest with whatever their resources and capacity is. And we thought that this was a really interesting idea about democratizing our economic participation based on what your means and resources are. And we like these ideas about what we understand to be an inclusionary public realm. There was also sites moving into, this is a site in Ivory Park. If you look at the yellow pieces out here, the yellow piece is the first infrastructure, the inherited infrastructure. The blue parts, it's an existing house in the townships, and most of our townships were designated to be dormitory residential areas. And we're finding that there's an incredible level of incredible adjustments that's been playing out to make sure that there's more economic opportunity for these households and livelihoods on the street. But the way they get added on is with an incredible sophistication that manages risk and opportunity. And the risk is a strange risk, because the risk is from our institutions, from our state officials that are sometimes not seeing more holistically the need to create economic opportunity within these sites. So we've got some regressive land use issues. And what we get excited about here is how an operator or a user or an occupant of a site is able to make some radical adjustments in the front of their buildings, in the back of their buildings, that there is no front yard, no backyard. And what this particular owner has done is actually created a public passage in between with a public bathroom. So there's a funny thing that plays out where these buildings and these additions have got a highly sophisticated sensibility around who its users are and how it needs to work within a space. So we got excited about how these adjustments play out. I think the one thing I wanted to mention on here, if you look at that plan, there are about 13 things there that are illegal according to the building code. And some of these 13 things that are illegal are absolutely valid because it's a matter of life and death, but not all of it. And we're finding that some of these things are stretching the limits of our current legal understanding about what's accessible and not. And what we find is that we'd like to advocate for certain behaviors that while it may push over the legal understanding, is actually helpful to advance allowing our legal system to have more beneficiation for people. So there's this thing about the grayness of our legal of infringements. And then we find that there's streets that are being made through the appropriation of our backyards, that our cities and our plots are designed to operate in a particular way, and that if a street changes, you find incredible activity playing itself out on boundary walls, on sidewalks, on garages, on rooftops. And each of these kinds of maneuvers have been documented to try to understand what are the patterns and to develop a lexicon of approaches and adjustments that play out. And then over time, these things become, you'll see on that street configuration there, that the blue portions with everyone adding their little bit of encroachment create some of the most dynamic and lively streets within Ivory Park. And these are the kinds of streets that we admire when we go to Hong Kong or some of our Asian cities. So yet there's an early formation about moving towards an urbanity that I think is quite productive, wholesome, and integrated, but it is also illegal in the current legal framework. And I think that the challenge is to just assess what we think is productive versus what is legal in these things. And that what we find also peculiar in the way these sites are occupied, that there's an incredible rate at which these sites operate. The image on the left, this is in downtown Johannesburg, is that you're seeing really interesting architectural invention play itself out. The churn of, or the movement of goods within this area is so fast that you basically collapse your storeroom and warehouse to your shop front. So the guy on the left has got no time to take his shoes out and display it on a shop front. He's basically sitting in the storeroom and selling the boxes of shoes at the same time. And I think that these become really interesting architectural typologies where we don't look only at the shop front, the storeroom, the warehouse, and the supply chain, but you start messing around with the kind of systems of how goods move and the architectures that support it. Now, this part of downtown Johannesburg was quite interesting for us because within these sites, we found within a 65 block kind of window on the right-hand side, we did this work with Dr. Tanya Zak and Progresses. We found that some of the most extraordinary entrepreneurs and business owners in these spaces that was occupying parts of downtown Johannesburg in quite unique and inventive ways. And we found that there's certain kinds of ethnicities and certain trades that occupied certain buildings, spaces, and created unique kind of agglomerations or zones within these spaces, all organically. And that there was some kind of what we call pioneering businesses. These are businesses that open up the gaps and the crevices and allows others to follow. And they created really interesting patterns about who uses what and where and how do you find the support services for different ethnicities. These buildings have an existing kind of framework. They lifts are in a particular way. They have parking basements. They floor to ceilings, allow for rampant appropriation, and some don't allow for appropriation. And you'll find that there's some buildings in downtown Johannesburg that have been offices that have been converted into shops. In one case, there's a shop here. There's one that has 356 shops inside. And to give you an example of scale, the Mall of Africa, one of the biggest malls in the country, has 400 shops. So you've got an incredible trading density playing itself out here within the buildings that was not designed to be a retail facility in the first place. So there's a power and a resource within people that needs to be acknowledged and integrated in the way we imagine our cities. And that rampant adjustment plays itself out through really micro maneuvers that everybody can adjust, define, and make their shop based on what their goods are, their capacity, where they're located, and take crevices under staircases. They can even take a column, for example. And there was interesting logics about how trading spaces became surfaces. Within these spaces. Basements got reappropriated, levels change, even a shelf became a space, and really interesting practices about how do you buy, one person buys a legitimate space and subdivides it into smaller micro shops within these spaces. So these kinds of micro adjustments and architectures playing out iteratively over scale creates quite extraordinary cities. And what we find playing out here is that it created a phenomena where that 65 blocks in downtown Johannesburg has got a cross-border trade that does not serve Johannesburg. So in a funny way, the downtown Joburg that seemed to be the main CBD is actually some kind of phantom city because people aren't buying and buying and using in that space. This is all a conduit that takes you to other parts of the continent. And these are taken out through these kind of conduits and channels. And this is some of the work that was advanced in the Unit 14 through one of our students, Kennedy Chikarema, who looked at what these trade routes are, where the police officers stand, where your tax systems, your informal tax systems apply out, and how a bottle of shampoo that is 20 Rand in South Africa can go up to $20 in Bulawayo, for example. So, and that is all facilitated through this bus, where the commuter bus gets hacked to become a freight bus, where goods such as mayonnaise and eggs and maize that is limited is shoved in all parts of the bus to take it out. So there's other examples for us, which is around Evelyn Street. Now, this is in Windhoek. The red dots illustrating all the shebeens that are playing out within Katatura. And I think the point that is seeking to be made here is that when we're looking for really, really big adjustments to our urban environments, often the idea is like we need the budget and the money, and often the World Bank comes in and we need a foreign donor. And I think that for me is a little bit problematic, because I think we can show through really careful observations of looking at the existing patterns and forces within our cities, our people, and our environment, we can harness that to be a lot more productive for us. So these red dots were playing itself, these bars were playing out all towards the township. And the Namibian government said, listen, while you are illegal, if you trade on these yellow streets, we won't criminalize you. And what that's resulted in is tons of bars opening up on Evelyn Street. You'll see there's 61 bars opened up in Evelyn Street, and this became a highly problematic issue for the city and its people, because it became a site of incredible drunkenness and uncontrollable kind of toxic behavior that was playing out on the streets. But what was interesting, that since 2008, and this is why I'm asking that we suspend our judgment for some of the toxic plays that are happening within our city, just to understand what is it making. So in this 2008 study, we saw 61 bars, and 8 years later, the bars increased but only by 16. But what it brought in its wake was an incredible complexity of economic activity around the spaces that allowed building services, restaurants, churches, butchers, and printers to be part of the space. And that is making a city for us. And that was quite exciting. And that was with no money from the state. All they did was adjusted their policy on how you trade. And I think that what we found interesting is that while we can talk about these kind of bars and taverns, what they do hold is a set of really interesting social relations around it. And we cannot remove the architectural product from the kind of social infrastructure that makes these sites. And that, for me, is a really important insight to understand this reciprocal relationship between the occupants and the users of these spaces and what these physical infrastructures are about. And then it starts creating a high street that is not what the city sees the high street to be. It's not also what you see physically in there. There's another kind of high street that is presenting itself underneath, that is centered around the leisure life within this neighborhood. And that is the generator of urban form and urban life within this space, and not the taxi rank, and not the shopping center or the municipal car wash that comes up. So I do think that we need to rethink about what are the catalysts within our neighborhoods and our streets. And this is a strange thing that plays itself out, that before these, and it's a thing that we have in South Africa, that with the townships being these dormitory settlements, they've got a very particular time frame within which they're active and the window for trading. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that in Katatura, because of the nighttime, because of the trading density you have here, shops don't close at 5 o'clock. They stay open up till 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, and allows for other uses like braaiing and haircuts and social life to play itself out. And if you tell me that in any environment I can give not 8 hours of trading time, but another 50% more, you create incredible throughput and value within these communities and societies we work. And the idea of the social life, I think that we start to understand within our buildings. This is in downtown Johannesburg in Hillbrow. We thought that a city block is a city block, and you look at the physical infrastructure, not realizing that underneath each of those buildings, or behind each of those buildings, those trading stalls or those streets, there's an actor in there that has got disproportionate power to make decisions. Not the owner of the building, but it is the guards, the gatekeepers, who actually determine how public life plays itself out by managing the entrances to these spaces and how these places are used. And I think that in conceptualizing how we make our cities, our streets, and our buildings, that the programming and the curatorship of the social life within these buildings is an absolute prerequisite to make our buildings work. So following these kinds of dispatches from the field, these are the kinds of things that came out that I thought was interesting. There was 10 things that I thought I'd share with you today that in a synthesized way that I thought would add some value to our conversation. One is that incrementalism matters, that these things are all small micro additions and aggressions, often non-threatening and transcalar. They are extra legal. Not everything sits within the current legal framework. And I can tell you in South Africa, we've got a history of having bad laws. So I don't take our current laws all too seriously, for better or for worse. But that subversion is quite productive. And that investment within these sites are carefully calibrated towards risk and opportunity. And they are stupidly simple. That there's a city and an architecture that is handmade. It allows for adjustment by a set of individuals with a particular set of skills that allows you to make changes as and when, and it's got a very low and accessible technology. It is hyper responsive. It senses perpetually risk and opportunity and almost has a thing of being alive, and has an agility where it's sensing. And this idea of impermanence, that what you put in now will not be there in a few weeks' time, a few months' time, or a few years' time, that it is highly customized to meet a very particular need, and that the social infrastructure is central to all of it. And there's a reciprocal relationship between the social life and the built environment that plays itself out in a very synergistic manner. And inheritance, that often all of these are about inheriting existing infrastructure and reappropriating it. That it's often transformative. It takes an existing site or condition and fundamentally changes its use in a really impactful way. And underlying all of this is a motive, and there's a social motive behind this, often around survival and opportunity. Some of these are about, they're all about transactions. These transactions are sometimes hard, invisible, soft, dark, extractive, and productive, but there's always a motive. And I'll add another one, which is the most troubling of all of these things. So while I'm quite excited about these kinds of the vocabulary that comes out of it, what is bizarre is that there is no architect that was central to these things that I thought was the kind of insurgent architecture that was produced through this idea of being anti-fragile. And I thought that, sure, that's a thing to keep in mind. So then as an architect, what do we do? Because if I do feel that the world that I've just shared with you and observed is going to be the dominant world, and sooner or later it is going to be the way we're going to need to practice, and we may not have the luxury of working with paid commission clients because of the nature of the disruption within our industry. And I think it's important for us to reflect on what it is that we are doing and how do we go about doing it. I'm trying through this practice, and I'm trying to almost borrow from the insurgent practices that I've seen and integrate it into my practice and say, okay, so I do get commissioned to undertake kind of traditional, rather straightforward building work. But within the practice, there's all sorts of experiments that's playing out, and every experiment is an excuse to advance the ideas I've shared before. And there's an acknowledgement that the terrains that we have are quite layered, they're malleable, that what we put on top sometimes will become underneath, and whatever you put on top does have an underworld that you have to recognize, and that there's a series of relations that play out. And the more sensitive we can be to these relations, the more productive an architecture we could have within this, within our spaces. And I think that while it's really interesting to observe, I think that as a practitioner and an architect, I think we are really fortunate to have an imaginative capacity, and we need to imagine. But how we imagine is the tricky thing, and where do we imagine from is important, because I think sometimes our imaginations get the better of us and we imagine things that are so ill-equipped to fit into the reality, the lived reality that we have. It becomes an imagination that becomes fantasy. So often what we try to do is try to imagine that when we inherit sites, that there are things that are quite incremental in the way it gets built, and sometimes it won't get built the way we imagine it to be, and that is also okay. But we do think that the way we're asking that when we imagine things that we don't have a fixed image on it, but to start suggesting that these things get built on and that it will be co-produced over some time, and that the architect's kind of job is to be a provocateur, to suggest a direction to go in, and how we get there matters less, for me at least. Yeah, and I think that when we do some of the work, there's some larger projects around proposals for zoos, for example. There are lessons on how to be insurgent, to have dominant landscapes and have kinds of follies in it, and to have some fun with the way we make it. So while it's quite large in scale, we find that these logics and understandings can play itself out in our proposals. There are also examples where we have some really customized projects. So, for example, in Port Elizabeth, or actually in Uitenhage, there was stories about how hair salons work and the risk they face with having their goods being stolen, and how we don't have to fortify the entire salon, but create a really small space for the salon. And one of the key issues was that some of the customers needed to be there for extended periods of time, and they were the primary caregivers for the young children. So the tension between being a caregiver and having your hair done became a tension. And through understanding that particular story, there's an architecture that gets generated from that puts together street markets, playgrounds, and hair salons in one go. So these are kinds of examples, almost like a collage of sorts, of a set of programs that are responsive from stories of this place. And then there's examples of larger buildings. So these are ones which is like we're calling it, it's a People's Motoring Academy by one of the car manufacturers in the Eastern Cape, which looked at some of the everyday township activities and facilities, and how we had a building that had quite formal regulated uses on the inside, and there was a series of openings that allowed the life of the township to play itself out without compromising on some of the management issues of the building. But the building became something that served two users, one who had call it a formal use inside that was paying for it, and those where it had a certain generosity to those on the outside and could absorb some public life. And the way these programs were put together had a sensibility around the economic life of these buildings, and also allowed it to, what did I say, like breathe almost. So it could have a 20% occupancy and be fully functional, and it could have 120% occupancy and also have a functional without feeling overwhelming or at odds in terms of scale. And these are examples of projects where one may have a building, but one needs to understand the ecosystem within which the site sits, and what are some of the assets and the attributes within this area that the site, the site that you inherit and can intervene in, can influence the way that larger ecosystem works. And through these projects, you'll find that we took an interventionist approach. So it's stealing again and borrowing from those ideas of small incremental moves that become cumulative over time and fundamentally kind of hack into an existing infrastructure over time. And through that, there was all sorts of interior maneuvers that was played out where the interior became very public because we could put a 24-hour vending machine in there, and there was programs for school kids to be safe and to do their homework, because that was one of the pressure points that they had. And how do we make a street? So on the right-hand side, that's an example of the building that had a really poor street condition, and you started to make an internal street with another, and augment that street with more life and vibrancy. And these are some of the examples of what can play out. And so while those are kind of responses to architectural buildings, there's also experiments. And I think one of the key things that I tried to expand on is that this idea of work, that if the unit looked at exchanges and economies, that central to at least my obsession is that our relationship to work, it is such a dominant part of our life, and it has such an incredible capacity to make our cities and to make our architecture. And I was able to explore this theme through the Center for the Less Good Idea about 2 years ago, and was able to work with a series of extraordinary artists to expand on this idea. We looked at objects. the histories behind these objects, how they could be reappropriated, hacked, manipulated to perform other things. It was a really playful space to mess around in and to conceptualize ideas around how performance works and how human beings appropriate sites and become almost these things become prosthetics. And I think that it's not too dissimilar to my architectural interests, where architecture is seen as a really customized device that supports the desires and aspirations of its users and occupants. This was a drawing that suggested the ambiguity between the performer, the prop, and the stage. And the stage here basically went vertical into the wall. You had performers that were performing on that and could actually be taken out as a prop from the stage and being used and put back. So it was just basically a stage also that was both horizontal and vertical. This is the final installation of how it looked on, and for my sins, they asked me to be a performer on stage, which I was not so comfortable with, but I did that anyway, which was quite fun to do. And then this thing about this relations, that we are as architects setting up a base infrastructure that would enable a set of social relations to play out, that needs to allow for another tissue of adaptation to play out. I don't think that we need to remove ourselves from making decisions, but we need to understand that first fit infrastructure and the infinite possibilities of a social public life that can play itself out on these things. So this was the installation for the stage that we had for one of the seasons. Now, coming back to the High Court, that really traumatic, hard space that we had. I remember chatting to some of the guys in the studio afterwards, feeling incredibly overwhelmed and in a state of despair after feeling the weight of it. And we're like, what on earth do we do in these sites? And I think that the idea is to not go into a state of inaction. I think we need to do something. You can't not do anything. But the thing that you do needs to have an intelligence in it that doesn't assume to have all the fixes in place, but needs to put something in place that allows a response, and for us to read that response and add another kind of reaction onto it. So this thing about putting a first fit infrastructure in that invites more and more additions, and it may not be by yourself, by a series of other actors. So in the High Court, one of the key things we tried to do here was to manage some of the stormwater matters that was playing out, and to give the court a really large plinth. And this plinth needed to do two things, quite a few things. But what we tried to do was manage this thing of grandness and intimacy, that when you come out of the court, often some of the cases are quite hard to hear, but you've got this journalist that's out there. And we wanted to see, is there small breakaway spaces where you could just be with yourself after being part of a hearing that has been in your favor or out of your favor. And we thought that there's this thing about this big institution also understanding the kind of humanness of the cases that played out. So what we created was this elevated staircase where you're not out in the street yet, and these little niches where you could recede into to have a conversation with one other person, to seek counsel and just to be in conversation. So these are some of the moves that was made to say that we don't want to be caught in no action. We need to do something. So what has been shared here today is just this idea that I think I'm coming back to this thing of this crisis that we find ourselves in. I declare it a crisis. I can't see another way out of it, and I'm if someone tells me we're not in a crisis, I'd like to hear how so and show me an example of it. But I do sense that we are in troubled times, and I don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we retreat from it. I think we have a responsibility to engage in it, and I'm for myself and engaging it in a way that I would like to argue to be insurgent, and to lean on these ideas of being anti-fragile. I think that this world of crisis is going to be our dominant world, and I want to become quite literate in this as soon as possible. So what I'm seeking to do going forward is to expand what these insurgent architectures are, what their languages are, what their patterns are. And through understanding the patterns, one is able to bring a little bit more certainty to the volatility that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Yeah, Thiresh, thank you so much. What an extraordinary presentation and range of ideas and work and thinking. I have a lot lot that I'm kind of churning in my mind in response to that. Just as an immediate response, I mean, I think that what's impressed me is the way in which you use architecture or the agency of architecture as a tool of research. That the drawings don't appear as illustrations, they appear as explorations of ideas, as a kind of inquiry. So I find that very exciting, but I'll share my thinking a little bit later. But I would like to just open the floor and invite any questions from the floor. You know, if there are any reflections that anybody has had, and if there's any thinking that anybody has had. And looking in the chat, there have been quite a few comments early on, I think quite early on in the talk. Chris Rojas said some assaults of the window washers happen in Malawi when people help cars out of the mud for a fee, for a few cents, a comment earlier on. And then Romario says, this research reminds me of the occupation of the Nagakin capsule tower, whereas the occupants adapt an architecture with a specific program in mind and adapt it to the occupants' specific needs and wants. But anyway, those are some initial comments, but I'd like to invite any questions from the audience. And I should let you know you've had quite a significant audience this evening. I think it's a bit of a GSA record for attendance, so congratulations on that. We're clearly going to need to ask you back, but I would like to invite any questions from the floor. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Thank you so much. Sorry for the light here. It's the only place this time I can take part in this event. So Thiresh, thank you so much for your presentation. The idea of participatory planning, and particularly the idea of what I call, and you have a more interesting way to give the name to the same concept, I call corrective design, you know, but your term insurgent architecture, insurgent practice seems to me far more interesting. I don't want to take a lot of time because I believe that a lot of people have a lot of questions. I just want to say a couple of things. You know, I really like the way, you know, you talk about, you know, integrated built environment and how you connect these to something that one can call also sort of integrated research method, you know, because your presentation would sit very well in any anthropological department, you know, because your work is so anthropological, you know, so ethnographic. And you even talk about ethnographic drawings and so on, you know, so a lot of stuff, you know, that I think we will continue talking about during the year. I just have two, I have two questions. One question is conceptual. You talk about frontier urbanism, and you gave the example of your work in townships in Namibia and so on. I just would like to hear something about that. Why you call frontier urbanism? What you mean by that? And also, you know, you use a lot of words that belong to sort of the same family. You know, like lexicon, description, even ethnography, typology, and so on. And it looks like your method is really related, you know, your method is really related to these concepts, you know, how to produce lexicons, how to create typologies, how to understand the world, you know. So my question is, how to go beyond that, you know? So what would you advise? What would be a way to to expand the architectural inquiry, you know, not just to make a description of what is out there, but really to use methods to ask questions, you know. So how you ask questions? How do you ask architectural questions in your work? I hope it's clear.
No, I pick up two questions that I'll respond to. I'll start with the latter one. So this thing about the lexicons, I think that was necessary for us to do some pattern recognition to understand in families. And you find that we start when you got it in a lexicon, you start to understand what are similar and what's different to these things, and it's really helpful as a means to work. For myself, what I would like to do to expand this further is to advance built realizations of this work. I do think that this experimentation in the field live will matter a lot. So this is where the practice is starting to shift and pivot a little bit, where a lot of our work now is starting to look at these interventions, and we could basically go and look at how they're performing or allow others to read into these things. That's the contribution we're seeking to make. I think that it's not going to be staying within this practice, but we'll go and make some stumbles. But it's stumbles based on what we've developed over the last 14 years. So the thing about moving on from the lexicon, it's less drawing, more kinds of realizations, and to see what comes out of that and to test the ideas. And this thing about frontier urbanism, for me, it's this urbanism that is literally on the edges, and it's becoming something we don't know. It is pushing the envelope and the thresholds of our current understanding, our logics, our physical infrastructures, and it's got extreme pressure on it. And when I say frontier, it's literally on the cusp of something, and I can't tell you whether that is the cliff edge or great prosperity. So that frontier is, I'm saying it's indeterminate, whether it's good or bad, but I think as built environment professionals, we can intervene as to which direction this thing takes. So the frontier for me means it is more pioneering and pushing the limits of what our understanding is of our cities than what I see in other parts of our built environment. So it's things that are really pushing a lot.
Thanks, Antonio, and thanks, Thiresh, for that stimulating exchange. There's another hand up from Leslie Jellicoe. Leslie, if you'd like to share your comment or your thought with us.
Just a quick question is, as you were saying in the last on the last question about, like, you don't know if it's a cliff edge or if it's it's a great boon or anything like that. And a similar thing you said when the relocation of all the bars caused like disdain in the community because there was so much drunkenness, probably violence, probably all these little repercussions to your design, like a design decision or so basically my question is, in your architecture, are you pushing for change first, or is it kind of like a let's first do no bad, or like architecture that does no wrong first, or like architecture that doesn't harm people in a mitigated way, or just find problems and then try make change? If that change doesn't come, then, but like as you say, like 10 years later you can see this was a good change for the community. However, the first couple of years maybe it's hard to see the bigger picture. So I'm just wondering how you kind of balance the desire for betterment contrasting with the possible negative repercussions.
I get that. I think that I think the point I made about inaction is also problematic. Like, you can't not do anything. I think we need to do something, and I think I'm advocating for doing something, to use the resources we have and the skills we have, but I'm asking for that skill to be deployed with a lot more intelligence, maybe empathy built into this thing, and that when you put something forward, allow the thing you put forward not to solve the problem like it must solve it, but to advance the conversation in some way. And I think sometimes we see these things as closed design. So it means what we put in, it solves this problem, but to say, is there a way of creating open infrastructures? I think the reference to the cell phones are quite great. These are platforms that others add their life and desires onto. And I think that sometimes I find the architectures we produce to be quite closed in terms of its design. That's finite, and it doesn't open up other possibilities. So I think that if the architectural response can be considered and to be carefully observant to what the patterns of life are in that environment, go forth and do something. But I'm seeing increasingly in these really hostile sites that we are throwing the same garbage forward, the same kind of assault of just concrete and brick with no intelligence built into it. And that for me is problematic.
Just a quick secondary question, if no one else wants to, is I see quite a lot of the ideas or the platforms that you put forward are iterative in its structure, you know, because of the lack of resources or the thing. Do you think this helps kind of with your research in a way that time is included inherently in your projects, which you know, other stages can change and stuff like that? Whereas if like it was a one-time project, you know, like most of these larger projects are, because they have all the funding, etc., that your design motivations and stuff like could change over time.
I'm not sure I fully get the question, Leslie, except to say that iterative design is good. I like it. I think it's small responses and allows to see the consequences of it and add on again.
Thanks so much for your question, Leslie, and a nice response there from Thiresh. There are a few more comments in the chat. I just want to read them out. Do you think that the empathetic approach could or should be deployed throughout other professions? And then he goes on to say, I love that there's an acknowledgement that the process will continue with the input of others, almost working as an organism and fulfill our momentary agreement. Yes, a resounding yes. Yeah. Any other comments or questions that anybody would like to share, or reflections? It doesn't have to be a question, it can just be a reaction to what Thiresh has shared. I think it's been a very powerful presentation. I think it's raised a lot of really fascinating ideas on many levels. Any thoughts or reflections?
I'd be curious to know if anyone thinks that we're not in a state of crisis, or like where we're heading to, because I'm quite curious to know where do we find our relevance as architects moving forward into a really disruptive world. You know,
all right, well, there's a hand up from Heather. Heather, would you like to pose your question? I don't know if it's in response to Thiresh's prompt or whether it's from an earlier thought, but please go ahead.
Hi, Thiresh. I'm reading a book called 1986, which is about the time of 1986, obviously, in South Africa, and it just struck me. So that was the year I started university, and it was a time of great flux and violence and change. And it just struck me when as I'm reading it, I'm just seeing, but like, you know, how some of the exact things are just playing out in a different way. Some of the same strategies, the same kind of disruption. And I think, wow, it's like we had a moment in time in which we did certain things, and now we have to reevaluate our strategies to move forward. So just a thought on that respect. So I think it is a moment of crisis, and I think it's interesting to think about strategies that we've engaged in our practices at different times.
Okay, I'd like to add something to that. You know, I recently started reading a book by Kim Stanley Robinson that's about the climate crisis. And, you know, I think what you've talked about, Thiresh, really, I think, and it goes back to Antonia's point about ethnography and social issues. I think that your focus has been on particular and in very focused ways, iteratively addressing social issues. But there's also a range of other layers of crises. So I think the methodology also speaks to those as well, you know, of asking questions in particular ways through the agency of architecture that address at multiple scales the idea of crisis and the role of the agency of architecture within that. And I'd like to ask you, I guess it's a sort of more broad-ranging question. I think you have quite an unusual practice. I think it's a very relevant practice, but it's quite an unusual in an unorthodox practice. And it seems to have been a practice that the formation of which has been driven by the motivations and your interests rather than perhaps commercial demand. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that. Has that been very difficult for you? Or is it that you have found that the more you push the ideas or the thinking that you're interested in, that the more you found work? Could you speak about your practice? And I don't mean the profitability of your practice, I mean in terms of the efficacy or the impact or the relevance that you feel that your practice has had within the context within which you work. Can you talk a little bit about your practice as an architect or as a designer or within the discipline of architecture?
Sure, it's a loaded one, because I think I want to come back to Leslie's point on that, because not Leslie's point, there was someone here that asked, did any of the speculations get built? And I think that comes back to your point, is that if you're not taking a commercial line on these things, you find that your built portfolio is compromised significantly because of that. So as a result, we haven't built a lot of these ideas. I mean, there's other buildings that examples of projects we could show you that haven't been built, but that is a price we've paid for keeping that line. So it's not been all great, like, oh wow, we've got some integrity, but we've had a compromise because the things that we thought that would be realized didn't get realized for all sorts of reasons. But the way I find with regards to the practice, I think what really helps to keep it both have a kind of clarity of direction and integrity, I hope, is the fact that we have a foot within the academy, or that for me is a really important part of bringing some stability in. And the research work we do is commissioned work. So we've basically said to people in the knowledge space, they understand data and information to have incredible value. And we found ourselves in a really unique position where we can package empirical data in a really powerful manner that is financially valuable to others, really financially valuable. So that's been really helpful for us. It's another kind of way of working as an architect, but we are keen to realize more work. So Mark, yeah, it does have a series of parts to it, and it's a perpetual juggling act to keep together. Hence my gray hairs, if you can see.
Yeah, another comment. I don't think I agree with this. Chris Rojas says, unfortunately, commercial profit always drives architecture. I'm not sure that's true. I think commercial profit might drive a lot of what's built, but I definitely don't agree with the idea that it drives architecture if one embraces architecture in a more expansive way. Trevor Zalid, yes, we are in a crisis when agility has become a key focal point in teaching and learning. Perhaps we can collectively recognize that we're at the threshold of a much needed systemic change. And then we have a comment from P. Duma. I admire the use of the term insurgents as its quiet relevance towards transformation in the context of the red tape built environment where the infrastructure is inherited. In the US, Susan Feinstein refers to these as injustices. And Engelan has a question. Engelan, would you like to offer your question? Thank you.
Thanks, Thiresh, for that. It's been really interesting for me, having known your work in segments actually over the years, to see it kind of the continuous flow of thought presented here. And really my reflection is on the question of practice. And I think that on the question of, built work and research, because your work in a way reminds me of the OMA work that was done on Lagos and the kind of mutations of the urban form. And there is a piece of architectural research that may inform policy and a kind of gradual shift in public opinion towards the amount of red tape and how red tape is addressed, so that architecture has a different voice at the policy-making level. And oftentimes architects desert that arena to planners and other professionals. And I think that the careful, precise documentation that you've done through your work makes a case in and of itself in the spatial conditions, and a powerful case to people who make policy that's backed up by strong research. So I think that it's not just the value of the data, but also the deployment of the data in a different space. So I think that to me is also architecture. And I think it's a field that architects often abandon, but that is certainly, to my mind, a natural home for the work that you're doing.
Thanks for that. Can I respond to it? Because one of the challenges putting out data, you've got to be careful of who's consuming it. So a lot of our work is directed to policy. We are able to shift policy because of the empirical nature of the data and the fact that it has a rigor to it and you can stand by it. Now, the issue for me is sometimes if we present data or insights that are overwhelming, that leaves someone paralyzed with like, I don't know what to do, that's a problem. And we're very mindful about putting that kind of insight out. So there's a really interesting thing for me, at least, is that when you put data, issues, problems out, I try within the practice to show how you can respond to it with bricks and mortar. That for me is a really interesting thing. So it's almost to basically say, here's a possibility to do something in a really small scale in issue to a really big problem that we're facing. So I do think the packaging of those that research is important because you could also encourage an architectural response. And so for me, that's a way of building a kind of relevance into it.
So in terms of the next steps that you were talking about, testing it in the built environment, you're almost wanting to do like a series of pilots.
Yeah, a series of pilots and experiments of different scales. So we have a few of them that we're exploring in the studio at the moment. And it's kind of nice to do it quite later on in your career versus early on. So I'd much rather take a journey of spending 13 years of reflecting and building and understanding. And now I feel like, hey, let's play.
Okay, thanks. We're looking forward to seeing the outcome of that.
Thank you, Angela. Nice prompt there. Are there any other questions? Are there any other thoughts or reflections or anything else you'd like to share with us, Thiresh? Or anybody in the audience, is there anything you'd like to ask?
What can I ask?
Yes, Finzi is here. Yes, come. Finzi is with me here this evening, so he's going to jump into my seat.
Hi, Thiresh.
Hey, how are you?
Nice
Good
to see you. I miss you at the GSA already. Two things, Thiresh. Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed that. But you will know, and your unit will know, that I was particularly excited to see the X factor in your presentation and that connection that has with Unit 15X. But my question is, but before that, Bob Marley sings, "He who runs away lives to fight another day." When coming back to the GSA, that's my question. First question. Second question, you have a picture of Obama and Hope at the back, and you have said we are in a crisis. Yeah. Do you think academy has hope or provides hope for the students in this crisis that we have now? Do you get my question?
Yeah, you ask difficult stuff.
But you know me, Professor.
but hang on. Let me talk to you while you're on the seat there. You know, the thing about hope, I have a tough relationship to hope, just because it sustained hope with no realization of actually getting there just keeps people in some kind of abyss and a falseness, which is so problematic. And then there's another kind of hope that we have, that you can actually realize something within our lifetime and it's tangible. So the tangible hope I like. The intangible hope I find problematic because it becomes a way of manipulation, right? And actually deferring quite a necessary project that must play out. So I just like to say that I see we got to be careful on how we use hope and how we do it. The Obama poster, by the way, less interested in Obama himself, but the artist who made that poster himself and the campaign that came around it. So Sarah Harding gives me a hard time about that all the time. So I don't like talking politics. I said, listen, it's an artwork. But the other point about the academy is I think that the academy, here's it. My hope for the academy is that it is the site of incredible awakening for our students. And I think that the awakening for me, Finzi, is that we are in a very different time. And I'm feeling that there's a lag with where the academy sits to what the real world is about there. I think that I've just felt like I went on a journey because I've been through all of these sites and I'm seeing this crisis play out at the scale of which it's playing out. And I'm seeing architects like myself becoming increasingly removed from what I think is some of the urgent issues that's playing out. And other players are coming in. And I think that the academy, especially the discipline of architecture, I think it needs to start looking as to where does it want to intervene with a disproportionate outcome. So where do you do very little with having a very disproportionate impact? And I think we need to step back a little bit to go forward. And I'm not seeing enough of it, unfortunately, right now, because I'm seeing a lot of the old patterns and ways of working still play out, largely, but not all over.
And when are you coming back?
I can answer that.
But thanks, Thiresh. Nice talking to you.
Hey, no, thank you. And for everybody who may not know, that's acknowledgement to Dr. Finzi Sadie, who's Unit 15 leader, and also he's the head of the Department of Architecture at the FADA, and another GSA key figure. And in terms of when is Thiresh coming back, well, he's not left. That's number one. And also Thiresh is part of another project that we're embarking on at the GSA, in developing advanced design research. Antonio Toma, who asked the first question, is leading that, supporting him on that, in looking at, looking more deeply at questions, looking more deeply at research in other disciplines, and how design research can integrate itself and embed itself with a range of other disciplines. And I think one of the motivations for asking Thiresh this evening was the active and agile, courageous and delightful way in which Thiresh is able to move in this space. And I think that might be a nice moment on which to draw the evening to a close. I think it's been a really, really engaging way to start the year. And I'm keen to work further with Thiresh during the course of this year with the ADR. I know he's going to be involved with the GSA. And I'd also like to thank you all for coming. We've had really a phenomenal turnout this evening. It's really, really heartwarming. I think there's a general sense of positivism at the moment. It does feel like, fingers crossed, I don't want to be too sanguine about this, like COVID is, so I'm hoping we're at the hump of it, and we've had to do engagement online as a consequence of the requirements of the university and directives. But we are going to be having another lecture in the next few weeks from Ilse Wolf and Heinrich Wolf, practice that I know, Wolf architects that I know Thiresh is very close to, and hopefully we can continue the tenor and the nature of this type of engagement. I think I've enjoyed the conversation after almost as much as I've enjoyed the actual presentation. But I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. It's been really enjoyable, really instructive, really valuable. I have a number of people here with me this evening who've all been captivated by the presentation and the atmosphere that's created. So Thiresh, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm looking forward to catching up with you next week. I know we have a little engagement planned, and thank you to everybody for coming and for your comments and your participation. And I would urge you, as we go through the year, whether in person or online, that we try and keep this conversation going and keep the dialogue going. I think it's a critical dialogue. Thiresh speaks of crisis, and I absolutely agree. We are in crisis. There is blood on the floor, and we need to try and address that. So let's keep this dialogue going. Let's keep the ball in the air. And thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you very, very much.
Okay.